briefly some information on the Committee on World Food Security, as well as the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. So the CFS, or the Committee on World Food Security, is the foremost governance mechanism for policy coordination around food security and nutrition. It has been reformed, and it now includes participation from civil society and indigenous people, of which we are part of as the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism. It includes member states, of course. And what is really unique about the CFS is that we, as the civil society and indigenous peoples, are admitted really as participants in this space, not as observers. We are participants, and that is quite unique in any UN space. And this really creates for an amazing dynamic where we are able to bring forward lived realities and experiences of our constituencies, be they fisherfolk, farmers, women, people, non-binary and other marginalized genders. And this dynamic space has produced several policy guidelines, which are, though voluntary in nature, have really helped advance the human rights agenda and the implementation of right to food. So today we are talking about the gender guidelines, and you will have a chance to ask questions. I would suggest that as speakers are speaking, if you have anything you would like to add or contribute or ask, please use the chat function. Towards the end, we will have a chance to really respond to as many of your questions, suggestions, inputs as possible. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker. It's my pleasure to invite Dee Woods from the Landworkers Alliance. Dee is a member of the coordinating committee of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples mechanism. She has been an active participant of the gender negotiations. She is going to speak about the negotiations and the expectations that we had as civil society, including some of the shortcomings of the guidelines which were recently adopted. So Dee, you have 8 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Ruchi. And I should add that the Landworkers Alliance are the UK member of La Via Campesina. So I'm representing and participating as a member of La Via Campesina. Where do I begin? This has been a long process for the CSIPM. It didn't just begin with the guidelines. It came from women and diverse genders who were already parts of the CSIPM about 8 years ago. And the actual work began in 2016. And this has been a tough process for the women and diverse genders involved. It has felt almost violent in parts because of the responses, because of how many of the member states reacted to particular concepts, and it was a process where we felt let down as women and diverse genders. But saying that, it is a partial win. This is the first framework on gender equality and women's empowerment in the CFS. So it provides a grounding. All right, it provides a first step on building on our rights, on building on our rights to food. But there are shortcomings, quite a few shortcomings. And I can't go through all of them in 8 minutes, but I will focus on the initial framework of intersectionality. I will look at violence and sexual violence and how that was virtually invisibilized in the process. And I will question whether, as women and diverse genders, are we even worthy of the right to food? Are we considered human enough to have our right to food fulfilled? So intersectionality was the original framework for these guidelines, and it became marginalized during the process. And marginalized in such a way in that it was considered contentious. And I think that was because people, even though the member states had agreed to it, I think the majority of member states didn't understand what it meant. And coming from the feminist world, coming from sort of the diverse gender background as well, all right, we understand that women and diverse genders do not live single issue lives. We have multiple oppressions that compound, and that intersectionality is about analyzing power and how this impacts on our lives. And this wasn't understood. This was seen as something that would bring in diversity, which was contentious as well, and it wasn't understood. And as feminists, it is the core of what we do, that we're organizing not just for ourselves, but we are organizing for everyone's lives. So when we have our rights met, others have their rights met. And it was exhausting. I have to say, it was exhausting, constantly having to explain what intersectionality is. The other aspect that was contentious was diverse genders. The patriarchy was alive and well in the binary, and trying to explain that not everyone identifies as a woman, and that we have diverse genders who experience oppressions that impact their right to food. And this was also violent. If you go to the CSIPM website, you will see videos where we expressed our lives and the impacts of having a diverse gender, of being diverse. And this was just not understood. And as Ruchi said, the power of the CSIPM is that we bring our real life experiences. We bring the voices of millions of people and their real life experiences to the policy table. And yet this was disregarded. So, you know, there's studies and studies of the violence and sexual violence perpetrated against women, girls, and diverse genders that impacts their right to food. And yet this was made invisible within this document. And I think one reasons why we're here at UN Women is that we need to strengthen our voices by being in solidarity with other women who are fighting and diverse genders who are fighting for our rights. And that became our clarion call. We exist and we demand our rights. And to this day, we continue within that Committee on World Food Security space to advocate for our rights and to build upon this document in other policy work streams. And I think the disappointment for us was that this is meant to be a transformative document. And yes, it might transform lives of some women, but to actually regress to language about gender responsive instead of gender transformative, to regress to words and concepts that we've long fought so long to change is indeed painful, but it has made us stronger as a group of women and diverse genders, right? It has made us stronger. And I will leave it there because I think, you know, so many other people have more to add. And I would like for there to be some questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dee, for that comprehensive introduction to the guidelines. And what a missed opportunity. We had all engaged, hoping and investing hours and hours, and as Dee mentioned, personal lives and stories and lived realities, because this has an impact on our lives, on our realities. And what a missed opportunity. I would like to now, so we're really pleased to hear now from Taina Hedman, who is from the International Indian Treaty Council, and she's also a member of the CSIPM Coordination Committee. She has been an active member of the gender negotiations at the CFS. I would like to now invite Taina to give her perspectives of the guidelines. Thank you.
Buenos días, gracias Richie. Buenos días a todas y todos.
Good morning. Thank you, Richie. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to this side event. I'm indigenous from the Kuna peoples from Panama, and thank you for allowing me to share my experiences through this experience on the voluntary guidelines on gender equality of the Committee on the World Food Security. And I would like to say that as an indigenous woman, I start from acknowledging what are our universal rights, basic and fundamental rights. I clarify that even though we are entitled to rights, we have been historically excluded from decision-making processes, the control of natural resources, lands and territories, and legal, economic and social access, among many others. It is essential that we have our rights of women that are recognized to participate actively in the management, access and control of resources, since our role is essential in order to advance in the sustainability of the resources and to encourage the good food and nutrition on which our people's survival depends. It is very important to highlight and to reinstate the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples and the declaration regarding farmers, and the importance, the very important recommendation number 39 of the CEDAW on the rights of girls and indigenous women. It is important that the rights of indigenous women and peoples are respected, and in particular the right of a previous informed consent, and the decisions regarding indigenous people should be taken in a fair and equitable way, respecting the ways of life. So we need to have a previous informed consent. This is not an option, it's a right. However, during the negotiations, we come across once and again making this clarification on behalf in front of member states that they keep on considering this right as an option. But I believe that after so many battles and fights of indigenous peoples, they can no longer prevail. Another important point is that indigenous people have a specific cosmovision, a specific relation with the land and natural resources. And this perspective, this cosmovision needs to be respected. Therefore, it's necessary to acknowledge the important different that exists between indigenous peoples and the local communities. These are not the same. And we had to highlight on this point many times. So any attempt of inferring the contrary is a violation of our rights. And I want to highlight Section 4A of General Recommendation 39 of the CEDAW that talks about multiple and intersectional ways of discrimination. This generated a lot of resistance to our generation on behalf of member states, even though we have colleagues here just presented specific examples, and these member states remain reluctant to use this terminology. Even though you may be surprised, there's another relevant term that caused a lot of debate and resistance, was to mention sexual violence, gender-based violence, even though these violence are something that are of daily lives in our communities, and this generated a lot of opposition. It is also important to recognize and guarantee the right of agricultural workers and farmers, because they have a key role in food sovereignty and food providing. They need to be subject to rights, and they need to have the access of resources that should be guaranteed to do the sustainable work. So I invite you to visit our website so that you can read the evaluation regarding the voluntary guidelines on gender equality and women's empowerment. And you can read this in Spanish, English, and French, and it would be really important for you to read it. It is also important that through all this long process that my colleague mentioned, it was not 2 years, but more. We have also seen in other kind of documents, this kind of discriminations and interference regarding the agreed language to use. You should know that through all these long process, in-person and online meetings, we encountered a lot of resistance in the mechanism of the civil society, indigenous peoples, and we needed to participate in the negotiation until we got the floor, because we are a mechanism representing civil society and the indigenous peoples. We do not feel heard or listened to. So the delegation had to leave the room. During a 51st session, the CSIPM made a minute of silence, and we were supported with other signs from other organizations in the room, and this gave importance to the negotiations. And we are also going to see that there's a YouTube link where you can see this rejection or this big pain or this feeling and how we expressed it. So even with these challenges, the mechanism gathered the guidelines as a baseline of inclusive work, and we want a true gender equity and the empowerment of women and girls. To conclude, so I urge you to think about this. There's no reason to celebrate. Our work should continue to eliminate gender-based discrimination, to reverse the oppressive patriarchal system, to conquer gender and equal rights. I would like to share this thought. When we are in this kind of negotiations, when we use an agreed language in the United Nations spheres, and when we're going to use it, they say this is not to use here. This is just for the meetings in New York and not here. I would like to understand how we can use this language, if this is an acquired right for us as indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taina, for those really powerful words and bringing in this crucial dimension of indigenous people's rights and their deep connection with the land and the cosmos. Thank you again. It is now my pleasure to invite Ms. Berioska Morrison Gonzalez. She's the alternate representative for the permanent mission of Dominican Republic to the Rome-based UN agencies. And we are really grateful and pleased to have her here, because Ms. Gonzalez actually was the co-chair, and she saw these guidelines to completion. And as you've heard from my colleagues, we had several tense moments, quite difficult negotiations. So we really appreciate, Ms. Berioska, you and your leadership. And we would like to hear from you what member states and other actors could do in terms of implementing these guidelines and, of course, continuously improving and advancing human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me the floor. I hope you can hear me well. I did prepare my remarks in English, but I probably switched to Spanish in a bit, but I'm gonna do the main part, I'm gonna do it in English. And of course, for responses and comments, I will go back to Spanish. So thank you so much for giving me the floor and for inviting me to take part of this very important event. Let's not forget that this is a side event on CSW. When I was posted in New York before coming to Rome, CSW was always an amazing place to be at for a woman and for a women diplomat. I think the sorority, the diversity, the knowledge, the optimism that one felt knowing that things could always be better when we pushed together was really unmatched. So I'm very happy to be part of it, even if virtually. As you've heard throughout the event today, these guidelines were endorsed by member states and all participants during CFS 51 in October. And let me please say that it was a pleasure and I think a learning process to be part of this as co-facilitator towards the end of this collective effort that guided us and helped us to pass the finish line. And I think all participants have to feel proud of that. I mean, at least of that. However, it was, as you've heard, a steep climb, to say the least. And the reason why I was so hesitating to take this forward, it was just because of that. It is such a difficult subject, and it shouldn't be, but it's such a difficult subject, you know, on all this for us. And it was not a perfect outcome. Having participated myself in so many of these multilateral negotiations, this is a feeling that one has to learn to, I would say, unfortunately, live with. These documents, and especially these voluntary guidelines, are the result of negotiation and consensus. So by default, they are not what we expect when we start. So participating in these processes, at least we commit to advance, sometimes slowly, but to advance on so many issues that ultimately affect us all. But one very important thing that we diplomats, especially the ones working on multilateral negotiations, need to always try to keep in mind is to make sure that our efforts don't end up being just a very nice piece of paper, right? So these documents need to be implementable and have an impact, even if it's small, on the lives of the people that we serve and their communities. Even more when we talk about the lives of women and girls around the world. So please allow me to take this moment, please, to congratulate the CSIPM for their efforts during these negotiations. It was so good to be challenged by your commitment, your engagement, your activism of always trying to hold us to, I would say, a higher standard. It was a personal inspiration to me. So thank you very much. And I think as an anecdote, thanks. So as an anecdote to all of you, during the negotiations, one thing that I kept asking to some colleagues, especially to FAO colleagues, was, will you be able to implement this? Is this something that you can work with, you know, in your interactions with member states? And the answer was always yes. And how? And that kept me, and I think all of us, going, this is implementable and is a step forward. So this is where I like to focus on now, and is, you know, implementation. The adoption of this document, I think, marks a pivotal moment. But again, it's just the beginning. We've heard it before. Gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls will have to continue to evolve, and it will evolve at different speeds, in different national contexts. It will evolve. But for this to happen, we need a collective effort, and that is from member states, from civil society, from private sector, international organizations, and that is in the uptake and implementation of these voluntary guidelines. And I think all of these actors are important in their own right to advance this forward. So I will just focus on a few areas where I think we can improve implementation. I don't want to be too long, so I'm going to focus on just a few areas. So the first one is dissemination. And this event right here is an important step. We need to get out of the Rome bubble, the CFS bubble. There is a CFS bubble. And make sure that we let the world know of the important work that we do in this very unique platform. I was so surprised about how many people had no idea what the Committee on Food Security was, or the importance of the work we do. So to ensure this, I think the CFS is embarking on a very interesting journey that we all have to support, which is an action plan on increasing awareness, ownership, use, and usefulness of CFS policy outcomes. We need to engage in this process. It's the only way that we can make sure that what we do is known. So from the member state side, we have, of course, the primary responsibility for promoting CFS and the use and the application of the CFS policy agreements at all levels. But this dissemination needs to also happen at national level with the collectives that work on the ground. And knowing the guidelines very well can empower these actors to make sure that the decision-making actors know about this tool and how to use it. So dissemination is very important. The second part is institutional engagement. And I think from the member states' perspective, we need to try to beat bureaucracy. It's almost impossible, but I mean, it's doable. We need to make it work. And this document is a great example to do that. The document and the analysis that we make about the implementation of all or some of the content that we negotiated here needs to have a broad institutional reach to the relevant ministries, to the institutions that can actually make use of this. One efficient way to do it is engaging FAO representations at the national level, with their engagement with authorities and the programs, projects that they support and advise on. So FAO needs to take this as their own, as it is, and try to implement it in so many ways that they can do it at the national level. And then we have the parliaments. The voluntary guidelines urge governments to implement, strengthen, and introduce legislation promoting non-discrimination and gender equality. And this is one of the most important pillars of these engagements, and a very tricky one that involves grassroots movements, local engagement, local representations. It's very tricky, but it's key. So we need to work on that a bit more. And the third, and to me, the final point is financing to this initiative. Later tonight, FAO is launching this global commitment to enhance gender equality in agri-food systems. They're gonna do it in New York during the CSW. And this is a great initiative, at least, directed to countries, but from the global north, the global south, as well as multilateral institutions, UN agencies, CSOs, the private sector. And in our case, at least, we're looking forward to engage with FAO to see how can we best support them going forward. Without financing, all these activities are difficult to implement. So we need that as well. So I'll switch to Spanish quickly to conclude. So este es solo el inicio.
This is just the beginning. This is the beginning of a long path. We still have a long way to go, but I think that we need to acknowledge that this is a good basis. It's something that took us a long time and a lot of effort, but this reflects the effort of everyone working together to come up with an output that is not perfect, but we believe that we achieved against all odds. Thank you once again for the opportunity of receiving me, and I'm here for any comments or questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gonzalez, for really laying out some practical steps that member states and institutions can take in advancing these guidelines, but also for reminding us of the energy and enthusiasm that feminist spaces can offer. And which is why, as you say, we're here at the CSW this week, really hoping to reach out and form greater alliances with feminists in this space as well. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to invite our next speaker, Ms. Elisabetta Recine. She is from the National Council for Food Security, CONSEA, in Brazil. She's a professor at University of Brasilia, and she's also a member of the high-level panel of experts at the CFS. She is an expert on food and nutrition security. She has been a long advocate for food sovereignty, and we look forward to hearing from Elisabetta in terms of how we can advance these guidelines. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Ruchi. Voy a hablar en español. Bien.
Thank you, Ruchi. I'm going to speak in Spanish. So thank you so much for inviting me at such an important moment in time. A couple of days ago, it is true, we are going through a month of mobilization for women and their rights and equality. Therefore, this session comes in very timely. Dee and my former colleagues who have presented have already set forth the scenario and the ongoing process of negotiations of the guidelines. Now I'm going to talk about more overarching concepts or more general concepts. Is everything okay? May I continue? Okay. So some more general aspects and something that Berioska also mentioned. I don't think it's, although it's always necessary, but I don't think it's necessary in the sense that we have ample evidence and maybe academia-based, practical, political, stating that gender inequality and violation of women's rights are ever more present in those countries that have a political organization that is more inclined to authoritarianism, and also situations of poverty and inequalities. So gender inequality and violations of women's rights are a consequence, but also factors that are driven by poverty and authoritarian regimes. So when we fight for women's rights, or when we fight for the implementation of voluntary guidelines, more to get more concrete examples, we are actually facing a struggle that is really rooted deeply in other aspects. So when we talk about political organization or social organization of other countries at large. So from the perspective of the civil society, there is a struggle. The fact that the mechanism is part of, and organizations that are even beyond the mechanism are also part of. For the society, first of all, to become aware of women's role, not just in economic terms, but also in social and political terms. We need to really manage a change, a shift in that mentality, in that mindset, a change, a shift in culture. And that is not a short-term process. This is a process that will at least entail a few years. That is a mid or long term, but we need to really start and reinforce on an ongoing basis. And that is also a responsibility onto the organizations but that are working on it, but also responsibility on the society at large. It is a responsibility, but for the educational system in countries to start talking about a culture of respect towards women's rights, for example. In specific terms, with regards to the volunteer guidelines, I think that we don't only have two challenges, but I will be focusing on these two. One of them is that of making the guidelines to be known, that is to disseminate this information inside the country and down to the societies and in the field. One of the things that happens for the Committee on Food Security is not necessarily a result that gets to the countries. Berioska was mentioning that she was surprised to see how people and even governments were not really aware of the existence of the committee. So imagine what the situation can be within the countries, inside the countries. So there is a clear need, and not just for the women's and people of diverse genders agenda, but also for the Committee on Food Security to be further known within the countries and by all countries, by the different sectors that bear the responsibility both for the discussion and for the execution of those resolutions or outcomes of the negotiations of the committees. Any of us who has ever participated in the CFS processes know that all of us who are across the globe, of course, have contact with their countries, governors, governments, officials, but these are very specific contacts. That is, maybe only with agricultural sectors. A lot of the CFS has also that perspective about the necessary changes. So there is indeed a challenge within the CFS to be further validated and promoted at the national level in each country. Now, on the other aspect, on the civil society aspect, I think that we need to take on a mission to make the CFS agenda, resolutions adopted by the CFS, to be known not just within our organizations and movements, but also to be expanded. There are different movements, different organizations that have some sort of connection to our agenda, but that don't necessarily have contact with the processes and decisions made by the CFS. This adds to the need by the society to get to know from the organizations the proposals. When these proposals have a potential for change, not just specifically about the subject matter that is being addressed, but a change that will contribute in a broader sense towards social justice, towards the development of countries in a more coordinated fashion. So in that regard, I think there is an aspect that we see coming over and over again through the mechanism, through the CFS, and the agenda on health and food nutrition. And I thought this was one of the structural challenges that we need to face, that the rules, conditions, and principles of governance of food security and all food systems, we need to continue struggling for a governance system that may be representative, democratic, diverse, with control and social engagement, and that may be protected from any conflict of interest, because corporate capture of food systems have a further complexity. Because when we first started holding this conversation, there was a corporate control of those objective aspects of the food systems. But we see today a corporate control of all of the narrative as well. And this is a very significant aspect, because things that for us are absolutely obvious and evident and absolutely necessary are not necessarily understood this way by the broader or larger group. And in order to conquer those results that are aimed at and necessary, we need a broader social base than what we have today. Because of course, the demands and the fight of all of the organizations and movements are indeed essential, but the pressure that we need to exert for changes to take place are those that need to have a broader social support. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elisabetta, for really reminding us that gender equality and transformation is a long-term process that we have to continue engaging with in our own spaces. We, as the CSIPM, are looking to produce alternate guidelines on gender equality in the context of food and nutrition security. Hopefully that would be an energizing process. Thank you also for highlighting the corporate control on narratives, not just on the food system itself, but also on the narrative in terms of shaping the discourse. And that's really, really problematic. Thank you for highlighting that. I think we will continue raising these issues. Finally, and I think just a reminder as well, please continue engaging in the chat box. We have this fantastic opportunity of having this amazing panel with lots of experience, lots of insights. So please add your questions, your comments in the chat box. We will be coming to those shortly. So finally, last but not least, it's my pleasure to invite Tanit Iglesias Zayas from our co-hosts for this event, ACF, Action Against Hunger. Tanit is a gender expert at ACF, and she will be reflecting on the humanitarian context and food security and how the gender guidelines could be helpful or not. So over to you, Tanit.
Muchas gracias. Quería empezar
Thank you so much. I would like to start by explaining what Action for Under is. We are a non-governmental organization with over 45 years, and we are present in over 45 countries. We aim at eradicating hunger across the globe, and that's why we center on fighting the structural causes from food insecurity that may be external shocks such as armed conflict, climate crisis, and pandemic, and also systemic social injustices, among which we see gender inequalities, always integrating an intersectional perspective. Action Against Hunger participated in the negotiations of the guidelines on gender equality that have been tapped into by my colleagues, and we believe this is an essential political instrument as it reflects the priorities of people in communities that may be more affected by food insecurity. Aside of this, it has multi-sectorial recommendations and identifies the critical points in order to achieve the right to food for all. Here we want to, among the recommendations, we want to place emphasis on those highlighting universal social protection and humanitarian aid, and especially when we talk about climate emergencies, since these recommendations are very much aligned with priorities that we identify through our work in different countries. Today, for example, I'd like to share with you a study that we carried out not long ago to identify the possible connection between gender and climate change in the countries of South Asia. Results show that climate change exacerbates the existing situation and degrades socioeconomic and nutritional security and psychosocial conditions of girls and women. Aside of this shows that it exacerbates also the limited access to resources and opportunities. Agricultural systems at present are aimed at producing maximum yield. However, they have a limited capacity when it comes to facing climate change impact, and therefore they create significant damage to the ecology. Women are underrepresented in the decision-making processes with regards to adaptation and mitigation measures towards climate change, but not just there, but also when it comes to decision-making on daily items, and everything points or signals a barrier when it comes to accessing early warnings and their capacity for evacuating critical areas. And all of this makes them further more affected in terms of morbidity and mortality vis-a-vis climate crisis. In order to face the scarcity of resources tied to the conditions caused by these emergency situations, houses adopts practices that are ever more harmful, such as the taking girls out of school, the early marriages, or forced sexual exploitation and forced prostitution. Another strategy that has been adapting in this environment is masculine immigration, because women take on more leading roles in domestic decisions and community-based decisions, but this has in turn negative consequences because it adds to their workload, and as they need to also on par earn a salary. Climate change therefore exacerbates also gender-based violence, because since we see the exacerbation of vulnerability situations, men miss out on their capacity to exert the traditional roles, that of breadwinner and caregiver, generating frustration that may lead to violent behavior, what we call toxic masculinities. Aside of this, the increase of salinization in water sources and deforestation makes girls and women to go for longer distances to gather water and timber, what enhances or increases, the risk of suffering sexual violence. As international stakeholders working in close collaboration with civil society, we believe that states and institutions should commit to implementing the recommendations of the guidelines that we have actually addressed throughout the talk in order to fight food insecurity. We ask to reinforce policies and programs focusing on improving capacity of resilience, adaptation, and mitigation against climate change, and to fight against the loss of environmental degradation and biodiversity. All of this with an intersectional gender perspective. It is essential to engage farmers, indigenous peoples, local communities, and promote the development of agroecology. Additionally, we need to add funding and direct support to local organizations of the civil society and also community-based, particularly those organizations of women, feminist organizations, and rights-based organizations. We need to also systematize gender-based analysis during assessments of needs in context of humanitarian crisis, and we need to make sure that the conclusions and outcomes of these analyses may define, set forth, and guide the responses to provide. We also request the promotion and implementation of measures and actions that may in turn derive in an effective fight against all sorts of violence, especially gender-based violence. We also need to secure the engagement of women and girls in the definition of mitigation and management strategies. Additionally, we request significant participation of women and girls in deliberations and decision-making table with regards to adaptation measures or adaptation and mitigation programs towards climate change. This includes the engagement in debates for the Framework Convention on Climate Change, UN, alongside other international processes and plans. Action against hunger considers universal social protection as a human right and a key aspect to transform power relations, mainly gender inequality. It is an essential tool for us in order to secure food justice. We want to take the opportunity of this forum to ask from states that they recognize and implement measures to reduce unpaid labor by women. This can be attained through different systems of universal social protection that may be feminist. We also need for the states to secure effective access of people living in vulnerability, especially for rural areas or flooded areas. And we also need to reduce the double labor hours of women. We also would need to ask protection or to add for all of these people living in vulnerable conditions to be added to the universal social protection. For all of this, we need to make sure that states and institutions may come on board and commit to sustainably fund all programs of social protection. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tanit, for those remarks. And really, so one of the areas which was progressive in the guidelines was this recognition of universal social protection. Thank you for really highlighting that as well, which is really, really crucial, particularly in humanitarian conflicts and situations. I would like to request all the panel members to switch on their camera, if possible. If all the speakers could put on their camera. Thank you. So I will pass on to my colleague Marie, who has been monitoring the chat and who's going to be facilitating and directing some of the questions to the different panel members. Over to you, Marie.
Thank you so much, Ruchi. Can you all hear me well? Perfect. So I will start with a question to Berioska. So we are so pleased to have you and for you to give us some time in this session. First question is for you. It reads, based on your experience in the New York spaces like CSW and UN Women, and now in Rome, what are suggestions of joint work that you see in order to enhance the dissemination and implementation of these guidelines? And you have concrete ideas of actors, spaces, programs we should target. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie, and gracias por esa pregunta. Yo creo que es una excelente pregunta. Quizás
Thank you for the question. I think it's an excellent question. Maybe I don't have all the elements to answer right now, but I think that something very specific comes to mind, and that is the work that the FAO office does in New York. I think of them because this is a direct contact, and many of your organizations can have access to them. And I know that through them, at least to start, you can do more work of dissemination of these voluntary guidelines. I think that this is a good way to start, but I believe that we need to be we need to organize a lot of more events with UN Women and to involve these stakeholders. I believe that the audience and the participants in New York are quite aware of women's issues and gender issues in particular, but this topic of the voluntary guidelines is very specific, and in order to do this we need to work hand in hand with the FAO, because we of course, there are many other stakeholders or organizations that can allow us to share our message, but I think the first point of entry should be the FAO. I think that in my intervention, I said this, I believe that we need to get out of our bubbles. Of course, it's very important to get involved and to work with the UN New York headquarters, but I think that we need to get out of these bubbles. We need to work more at a community level. I think that from down to the top, we can work and we can try and reach more people and achieve changes. Of course, I agree with a good interaction with New York and see how we can work together, but I believe more on the change opportunity if we concentrate and focus on the work that we can do directly with the communities. Thank you. I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we have very concrete ideas that we can pursue this year and in the future. I will now direct a question to Taina, if she's still online. Taina, we had Suad in the chat asking if you could explain how agroecology can help advance gender equality, since you mentioned in your intervention about agroecology and its importance for us.
Gracias, Marie, por la pregunta. Sí,
Thank you, Marie, for the question. Yes, for us women, it's very important, agroecology. Why? Because this not only implies sowing for the indigenous peoples, but it implies a whole perspective, a cosmovision, the land, sowing, and people. So these help us women to improve our social economic conditions, where we can share our ideas in the transformation of our communities, our food, to be to empower ourselves as women and be active and participant in our spaces that help us feed the world. Because as women, we also fish, we also do our collectors, we're also in charge of the care work, and all this will strengthen our position and will help in food security. This is why it's very important, agroecology in gender equality. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Taina. Also, we could invite Dee to reflect on agroecology. She's also a practitioner. So I will direct this same question to you, Dee, and I will also add another question to Dee, which is a personal question. It was not in the chat. About the next step you see also in the CFS, because we have a reducing inequalities process of negotiations happening now. So if you could share what you think about the next steps for gender equality also in the CFS, it would be great. Over to you, Dee.
Thank you, Marie. I think in terms of agroecology and knowing that we have a diversity of people practicing agroecology, both in urban settings and in rural settings. The role of women and diverse genders is central to that. I think, I wrote in the comments about someone weaving together issues, and I think that's what the role of women and diverse genders is within agroecology, to weave together all these elements of not just food production, but distribution, culture, and basically keep our food systems knowledge alive. In terms of the current work stream on reducing inequalities, ideally we would love to build on the current document that we have, because it is recognized that women and diverse genders are crucial to our food systems, and that we're probably one of the groups most highly impacted by food insecurity, by the impacts of climate crisis, and of emergencies, and conflict. And I think especially within our caring roles, we're unpaid, and we're still keeping things together. So I think we need to move beyond that recognition and build something into this current process that will enable women not just to reduce that inequality, but to actually have some equity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dee. Mentioning that we really need to move to transforming systems and move to transformative approaches. I know you mentioned that, Dee, and this didn't manage to get this agreed language on transformative approaches in these voluntary guidelines of the CFS, but these are very important. Maybe for everybody's knowledge, I will invite Tanit to give us the definition and how Action Against Hunger approaches these gender transformative approaches in the work on an everyday basis, and to see how we can reflect on that for policy making.
Vale, voy a continuar en castellano.
Okay, I will proceed in Spanish. What we realized as humanitarian stakeholders, I think that humanitarian stakeholders have been verifying in the last years, is that our way of working was impregnating of the power dynamics of the societies where we lived, generally speaking, patriarchal societies, with other type of discriminations as well. So when we started to work at a humanitarian level, there were a lot of north-south dynamics and different hierarchies. And I believe that collectively we became aware, thanks to other people, that this system is perpetuating inequality. So therefore we need to change the way we work in order to try through our actions not to reinforce the existing inequalities. So initially, as an organization, Action Against Hunger, in 2014, we had our first gender policy. So we generated awareness, that is, we guaranteed access to all people without discrimination and taking into account all the needs. But what we were able to check through the years is that just by providing access and with including them in decision-making processes, sometimes this was not enough, because once we were no longer there, the dynamics had not changed, the inequalities were still there, and we could not achieve a long-lasting of all our efforts. Therefore, we adopted a more transforming approach, a perspective, and basically this is not something that is new, but unfortunately it does not exist. That is the capacity of assuring that everyone has the possibility of exerting their rights. This is something that sounds very pretty, but in reality it's far from becoming a reality and concrete. So all our interventions try to lead to this transformation, but transformation of the dynamics in society that exist at a society level and also internally within the mechanisms that work on humanitarian action. And this transformation, well, if we have a project, for instance, of food sovereignty, but we're not doing anything to change the law so that women can inherit the land, well, ultimately, once we finish the project, this project will have left nothing behind. So we need to identify the actions from different angles and perspectives, and taking into account the discriminations that you have mentioned and talked about many times, this intersectional perspective, and especially taking into account that all these changes at a society level, we're not going to implement them as a North stakeholder coming to tell something to a stakeholder in the South. We need to work with the different stakeholders from the different countries where we work, so that the civil society from the country establishes what the priorities are and how we can work together. So when we talk about transforming actions or transforming projects, we mean projects that try to tackle or attack or dismantle these power inequality that exists at different spaces between men and women, between different social classes, and also between rural or urban populations or indigenous populations. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanit. I will now turn to Elisabetta, there's a question drawing on the comment in the chat from one of your fellow HLPE member. The HLPE is the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. And the comment says that these directives and guidelines are very important, but they often remain at supra level and do not speak to local implementation so much. And now you, Elisabetta, with CONSEA, you have a practical space to explore this implementation at local, national level. What would CONSEA do practically to start implementing the guidelines in this participatory manner that characterizes this committee?
Bueno, gracias.
Thank you. It's very important to know that this CONSEA, it's a committee that is an institutional space in the country, and we are responsible to provide advice to the President of the Republic, and we also need to present a set of proposals that would be addressed to a group of ministries. So it's like 24 ministries that receive the proposals of the National Council for Food and Nutrition Security, CONSEA, in Brazil. Of course, and the gender equality and rights issues, not only the right to food, but human rights, generally speaking. Well, of course, CONSEA is organizing debate all the time and interpreting or reading Brazil's reality and how Brazil's reality interacts with the global reality. So we do a listening process, a very dedicated and sensitive listening with the different realities in the countries to come up with proposals. So there's a process, and it's a very dynamic process. It's not exactly that we just receive or take the discussions from other spaces as the CFS or other UN spaces, but we contribute with these discussions, and what we do is to transfer, or that is, the things that the CFS is deciding, we try to transfer them to the reality of Brazil. So there's many things that the CFS decides. These are things that the countries are in some certain aspects are more advanced, and in many other aspects they are lagging behind. So what we try to do is to adapt this to the country's realities. So there's a role regarding the CFS decisions, that is to organize the discussion on a certain issue or topic. So just to draw the general guidelines, and the countries need to discuss this internally. But this internal discussion needs to be guaranteed, that is, the participation of different sectors should be guaranteed, and of course the participation of the organized civil society, because it's not just a question that the CFS decisions should be directly adapted by different realities. This is impossible to do, so it's important to have an exchange in these two directions, and this is what we do at the Council, at the CONSEA, as we work with different UN agencies. We work on different agendas, and there's a specific concern that is the concern, and we work on this all the time. We organize an international seminar before the national conference, and this has to do with strengthening the lateral spaces, because we have a lot of issues here other than different spaces that are being privatized for different issues other than food safety.
Thanks a lot for this very rich and practical also answer. We saw also in the participants list that we have other permanent representations, and also our dear friend from UN Women who followed the negotiations. If you want to give some remarks, don't hesitate to open your mic and also share your perspective. I don't want to put you on the spot, but we have 5-6 more minutes, so it's open to you. Otherwise, we also have another question. I think we can, maybe it's a question to Berioska, because you concluded also this negotiations process and know the text very well. What do the guidelines do the guidelines focus on the engagement of men, and how are there any recommendations that want to tackle the stereotypes to really fight for gender equality at the root level?
Gracias, Marie, por la pregunta. Y justo cuando la estabas
Thank
leyendo.
you, Marie, for the question. And just when you were reading it, I was looking at the chat and I was reading that, and I was wondering whether I could answer this. Well, in fact, there's not much of this in the voluntary guidelines. There's not a lot about this, and I think there's a long list of things that were missing, maybe, but I would not like to repeat myself. I believe this is just a start. It's a basics. It's the start of a long process. And I think that there are many opportunities to implement and to interpret this in different ways. I think that it was also a very important moment, a moment of creativity and activism to know how we can implement these voluntary guidelines so as to focus as well on these challenges so that we can be more inclusive and we can embrace all the issues that we need to address. So no, I don't think there's a specific mention. Just by heart, I don't remember any specific mention to this. Maybe other panel members could talk more about this, but this does not mean that this is not an opportunity to advance on certain things. I think this could be a good example as to what we could do.
Thank you so much. We will close in a few minutes. So maybe I will answer myself one of the last question in the chat, which is on the next steps also for the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism regarding these guidelines, their dissemination and implementation and ownership at local level. So we have big plans, let's say. We are going to also take our share in this dissemination effort to make sure the guidelines are known. And we also will, well, this is an ongoing project, so it may not happen this year, but this is only the start, as many of you said. We will also build popular material that would really speak to the territories and the realities of local organizations, peasants' organizations, social movements, and so on. So the form is still to be defined. We are going to launch this process. And in this dissemination effort, we will also make a step to insist on the missing parts of the guidelines. Dee mentioned at the beginning that there was much more to do to understand intersectionality, for example, to make sure the guidelines also speak to gender diverse persons, and also give practical examples of gender transformative approaches that can be put in place. So all those aspects that we could not negotiate in a multilateral space, we will try to make an effort to bring this also at local level with all the organizations that are part of this big movement that is the CSIPM. We are obviously, you can reach to us at any time. There is a website of the CSIPM. So I stop here and hand over to Ruchi.
Thank you so much. And as Dee says, we exist, we demand our rights. And on that note, it will be great if perhaps everyone could switch on their cameras. We can see you as we start saying goodbyes. I would like to firstly thank each and every one of you for being here today, and for your passion, for your commitment to advance gender equality. I would like to also thank our interpreters who always do a fantastic job. I'm not sure how they have the knowledge of so many technical words and issues, but thank you. Would like to thank Action Against Hunger, who co-organized this and who really set up a lot of the thinking and who offered this side event as a co-organizing to the CSIPM as well. So thank you. Thank you to the Secretariat of the CSIPM. Thank you to our amazing, amazing, amazing panelists who spoke today. You've inspired us. You've inspired us to continue the fight. And yeah, and go well. Thank you, Marie, again, for really putting all of this together, bringing all of us as well. Really appreciate everyone's support. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you. And
Thank you so much,
interpreters.
Ruchi. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone,
Gracias.
for this fantastic
Bye,
side
bye.
event.
Gracias,
Thanks for
gracias.
the
Thank you.
speakers. Thank you, Ruchi, for the facilitation. Marie, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.